This romance was a new chapter for him, an opportunity to live a youthful life with someone that's very beautiful.
They were headed back to Southern California to celebrate their first Thanksgiving together.
The smell coming out of the bag was not something you can describe.
So the coroner investigator comes out, and he said, "This is a human."
And the lifestyle that she thought she was going to live was all a lie.
Things started to fall apart a little bit.
She wanted payback.
I did all this in 2 hours. Shut him up.
That's strange. And not only strange, that is insane.
I couldn't believe I did what I did.
In the city of Costa Mesa, the California dream is alive and well.
Costa Mesa is a relatively small town, and it is sunny all the time. A lot of people will settle in Costa Mesa because they can be so close to the beach without having to buy really expensive property.
It's around 2 p.m. on December 1st, 1991, when Costa Mesa resident Jose Escoval calls 911. He tells the operator of a concerning interaction he just had with his ex-girlfriend.
Jose receives a knock on his door.
He did look out the window and see a red Corvette in his driveway. Didn't recognize the car. He opened the door, and it was a former girlfriend, somebody that had lived with him on and off. They'd broken up a year ago, but still maintained a relationship. She was very disheveled, very upset, had gloves on her hands, wanted his help. So he invited her into the apartment, and she sat down and basically told him she wanted to elicit his help, his car, to get rid of her husband's body.
He says, "Hold on, just stay right there."
As soon as he was able to get out of her presence, he went straight to a payphone to call the police and say, "Hey, I need some help."
He identifies the woman as Omaima Nelson. Her husband's name is Bill.
Police dispatchers told him to stay put. An officer would meet with him very soon.
Born in 1935 and raised in Texas, Bill Nelson left a big impression.
Bill was a flamboyant kind of a man. He drove a red Corvette.
He was a dyed-in-the-wool Texan, known for his red cowboy boots and big belt buckles, and gregarious personality, fun to be around, liked to engage people, had a very bubbly personality, told tall tales and things of that nature.
This guy was larger than life in more ways than one. I mean, we're talking 6'4", 230 pounds, wearing red cowboy boots and a red hat. And many people, they took to Bill.
Bill Nelson had several wives, and he had kids with those wives, and he had grandkids with those kids. His first wife, I believe they lived in Florida, and his second wife in Texas, his third wife in Texas.
To earn a living, Bill was a jack of all trades.
Bill Nelson was a pilot. He crop dusted. He had a knowledge of computers to the point where he could take old ones apart and reassemble them and then at some point sell them. He also worked for a mortgage company.
By the early 90s, Bill was living in California. In the fall of 1991, he met a beautiful young woman who was also half his age.
One night at the pool hall, Omaima, she walks in, just kind of perusing the place. He said, "Who is that? Those high cheekbones, that beautiful hair?" She was this Egyptian goddess, and he wanted to know more. Omaima was born in southern Egypt along the Nile River, kind of near the Sudanese border, and she was really born into a village that was really poor.
Omaima was raised in a Muslim household. She was devout. She met a oil worker while she was back in Egypt, and they started a relationship. When her mother heard that the relationship was getting kind of serious, she insisted that they get married. And at some point after the marriage, he was called back to Houston, Texas, and she accompanied him.
Around age 18, Omaima is faced with the possibility of the American dream, to live a totally different life. When she arrived, she spoke minimal English. Imagine being in a country where you are not able to stand up for yourself, you're not able to communicate your basic needs outside of your partner, you rely on him for everything.
He turned out to be a violent man. So she became a battered woman at 18 here in America. She managed to get help from a battered women's shelter and get away from him.
In 1987, Omaima left Texas and headed for California.
After divorcing her first husband, she moved in with her sister in San Clemente, California, located south of Costa Mesa. And she took up several jobs, one of which was being a model at some lingerie place in the mall.
She was a beautiful, beautiful woman with high cheekbones, and, you know, people would look her way. But the money wasn't coming in fast enough. She wanted more. She was attracted to these older men. To her, they provided protection, they provided stability, and they provided money.
Omaima had the belief that if she found a nice older man, that man would both take care of her and be kind.
And at 23 years old, Omaima met 56-year-old Bill Nelson at a bar.
She sees a big old statuesque guy. He was commanding the entire room, telling his stories, had everybody captivated.
Bill wooed Omaima with his cowboy persona and promises of a better life.
He may have mentioned that he, lived a lavish life, had a red Corvette, may have even owned a cattle ranch.
For Mr. Nelson, I imagine this romance was a new chapter for him, an opportunity to live a young, joyful, youthful life with someone that's very beautiful.
Once Omaima and Bill Nelson met each other, they were inseparable for days at a time, even a couple of weeks before he decided, you know what, I want you to meet my family. So they took a road trip to Arkansas and Texas, and that's where his family was. And on that trip, they made a big decision. He made the decision to propose to her, and not just propose, but within a day, it's time to get married.
And he drove to Phoenix, Arizona, where a justice of the peace married him.
The newlyweds continued their road trip, sharing the good news with Bill's family.
Omaima was elated. She finally found a family that she felt like she gelled with. She really felt this sense of belonging thanks to Bill, her new husband.
Following the road trip, the couple looked forward to spending the holidays together.
They were headed back to Southern California to celebrate their first Thanksgiving together.
But 3 days after Thanksgiving, Omaima's ex, Jose Escobar, calls 911 to report that Omaima showed up at his doorstep, asking him to help move Bill's body.
Police dispatchers told him to stay put, that they'd have officers running over to his house on Monte Vista, but an officer would meet with him very soon.
While Jose waits at the payphone, officers head to his home.
When police get to Joel's residence, Omaima's inside. And one of the officers goes inside to speak with her, start asking her some questions.
She's dressed all in black. She's got a black blazer on, black pants, even black leather gloves on her hands.
When asked about her husband, Omaima says he is out of town.
He'd spent Thanksgiving with her on Thursday, and on Friday he'd left for a business trip, and she expected him back the following Friday. asked her kind of the circumstances around her connection to Jose. And she said she'd known him, past boyfriend. She'd come over to see if she could stay there because Bill was gone.
There was another police officer, a couple of them outside, and that's when they spotted that red Corvette.
We looked inside the Corvette. Officer Hogue spotted a 50-gallon trash bag, which was tied at the top, sitting on the front seat. So Officer Hogue removed it and set it down on the front yard grass and cut it open with a penknife. The smell is not something you can describe.
Is unfolding at a home in Costa Mesa, California.
Parked out front of the location was a Corvette, and Officer Hogue looked inside and saw a big trash bag that was tied at the top, sitting in plain view. Then Officer Hogue cut the bag open with a penknife he had. At that point, we could see a liquid substance in the bag, and the smell that was emanating from the bag was so powerful.
Meanwhile, officers find the homeowner, Jose Escoval, at a nearby payphone. Jose explains what prompted him to call 911.
About 2 in the afternoon, somebody was knocking on the door, and he looked out, saw the red Corvette, opened the door, and it was Omaima. She removed the black gloves that she was wearing. He saw that her hands had been cut with what looked like a knife. She had bruises on her arms, on her legs, so he invited her into the apartment.
She says, "I need your help." Jose says, "With what?" She tells him that her husband attacked her and she ended up killing him.
She killed him, cut him up. She had a trash bag in the car right now and would pay him a huge sum of money if he would just help her.
"I just need to move his body." And then she offers him $75,000 and 2 motorcycles if he actually obliges. He says, "Hold on, just stay right there."
Jose left the house and found a payphone and called 911.
Back at Jose's house, a grim discovery is underway.
The whole show was this bag that was in the back of the Corvette. One of the officers had taken the bag out of the car, opened it up. I look inside the bag, and I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. It just looks kind of nasty. I said, you know, this could be pig entrails for all I know. The thing that went through my mind, I need to identify this as human. Because I'm still thinking, this is some kind of gag. This is some kind of misdirection of some sort. I'm just still not believing that this is human internal parts that are in this bag. So we're going to need a coroner out here. So the coroner investigator comes out. We opened up a big plastic cloth to the ground, and we got the remains out onto the cloth. And then all of a sudden he says, "Hey, you better look at this." I go, "What?" He says, "Do you know what those little black spots on this organ is?" I said, "I got no idea what that is." He said, "That's carbon." I said, "It is?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "You know where that comes from?" I said, "No." He said, "It comes from smoking." And he said, "So unless you know any pigs that smoke, this is a human."
Investigators turn to Omaima.
We introduced ourselves, said obviously we don't want to really be talking out here on the street. Would you mind accompanying us to the police department for an interview? And she agreed.
But law enforcement has another priority before they talk to Omaima.
We were able to determine from her identification where she lived with her husband.
Officers immediately went over to that apartment to see if there was, somebody in distress, somebody hurt.
It was locked. We obtained a key from the manager. I decided we had exigent circumstances to enter the apartment to see if there was someone inside that was injured and needed medical assistance. Upon entering the apartment, we instantly ascertained that nothing was amiss in the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. Upon entering the bedroom, Officer Hogue and I entered together, and we saw blood spots on the side of a mattress. We then walked back out of the bedroom and entered the kitchen area, which was a mess. Sitting on the counter was a crock pot. There was a lot of dishes in the sink and on the countertop. And for some reason, I decided to open the top freezer door of the refrigerator, and I saw this round object in foil. And I tapped on it with my finger and said to Officer Hogue, "Hey, Danny, I wonder if this is his..."
Officers with the Costa Mesa Police Department make troubling discoveries inside the home of Omaima and Bill Nelson.
We saw blood spots on the side of the mattress.
They go to the freezer, open it up, big ball of aluminum foil.
We had the right, upon entering the apartment under exigent circumstances, to look to see what's in plain sight or even in a closet. But we would need a search warrant to get back into the apartment and to make a detailed search.
As they wait for the warrant to come through, investigators conduct an interview with Omaima.
We got to the station and escorted her to an interview room. She wanted a cigarette. It was obvious that she was distressed. She was talking a mile a minute. She had cuts and bruises all over her.
I had fighting Bob.
What happened?
Well, I went for a drink and two girls fighting with me there, and they got scratched.
Where is Bill away right now? Is he here in town, or is he out of town, or where is he?
He's out of town.
Did you tell Jose today that you killed your husband?
No, I did not.
What do you know about the garbage sack that was in your car?
Well, what is it?
Well, I'm asking you. What do you know about it?
I didn't know nothing about it.
Don't know anything about it? Oh.
Omaima offers an explanation.
She said Jose had, under false pretext, wanted to drive the red Corvette, had left for an hour. And when he came back, that bag must have been in it. So Jose must have put the bag in the car. Then she said she'd been to a laundromat doing laundry earlier in the day and decided to walk next door to a bar, but left her car unlocked. And during that time, somebody must have put a bag behind the front passenger seat. She didn't know anything about it. It would go from one extreme to the other. It was very non-cogent.
The interview goes on, and Omaima's story continues to change.
And then at some point she said that Bill had raped her.
He went tied me up. And I didn't know what tied me up.
What did he tie you to?
To the bed.
Did you kill Bill because he did this to you? Tell him the truth of it.
I didn't kill him.
Just after 10 p.m., the interview ends, as Omaima is escorted to the hospital for a physical examination.
A search warrant was granted for the premises, and I responded over to serve the search warrant at about 2 in the morning.
Investigators start in the bedroom, where the patrol officers spotted blood.
Next to what I presume was Bill's side of the bed were a pair of red cowboy boots and some boot shining materials on a rug. To the first eye, it looks okay.
The bed was made, mattress was on top. You lift the mattress and the blood was underneath it.
It's saturated with blood and the box spring. And then you realize that there was a headboard at one point on that bed, but the headboard was broken into several pieces and it was stashed behind the head of the bed. Did a search of the closet. A small steam iron in the corner of the closet was broken. The handle was broken off of it. Wrapped up in newspaper in the closet was also a porcelain lamp that had been broken and a crushed lampshade.
Investigators moved to the living room.
There was boxes piled up, computer parts piled up, laying around.
We saw that most all of these boxes contained trash bags, and in those trash bags were other trash bags, and in those trash bags were what appeared to be human body parts.
The disturbing scene becomes even more troubling.
We did find a box that had 2 human hands in it. It was obvious that the hands were cooked. You know, they looked to be fried or something. Detectives were searching the kitchen, and officers started going through the refrigerator, the freezer.
They locate the large item wrapped in foil.
Take that out, open it up. It looked like a human head. I mean, that looked like a prop out of a horror movie, is what it looked like.
And also wrapped in a piece of tinfoil were genitals, male genitals. The genitals appeared as if they'd also been cooked and wrapped in tinfoil.
This is a house of horrors. It was pretty shocking.
Investigators question whether Omaima is physically capable of such violence.
The thing for me is she's petite, and I knew from Mr. Nelson's driver's license that he was, over 6 foot, 250 pounds. But in one particular box, in amongst the trash bags, were a pair of human legs, and those legs had ligature marks around the ankles. At the foot of the bed was a wicker clothes hamper full of dirty clothes, and in amongst those clothes were what appeared to be bloody garments. There was a necktie, men's necktie that was tied like a ligature. There was a section of rope that had some knots in it that appeared to be a ligature.
She says that Bill tied her to a bed, but Bill was the one with ligature marks. So everything she was saying was a...
On the morning of December 2nd, 1991, Omaima Nelson returns to the Costa Mesa police station following an examination at a local hospital. She is met with handcuffs.
Well, I'm going to be placing you under arrest at this time.
Why?
For suspicion of murder.
I didn't kill him. I didn't kill him.
I remember driving with my partner down to the coroner's office to witness the autopsy. We get to the coroner's office, and the watch commander calls and says, "Hey, Omaima wants to talk to you again."
Just tell me what you want to tell me and I'll listen.
I think I did kill him unconscious.
You think you killed him unconscious?
Yeah, because he did this to me, and I couldn't believe I did what I did.
Omaima claimed that her husband became physically abusive shortly after the wedding. She told police that she began to cope with the abuse through drinking alcohol and using drugs. During this time, she also told them that she started having visual hallucinations and auditory hallucinations, telling her to murder her husband.
So all I remember that I hit him to self-defense or something.
How did you hit him?
I think I hit him with the lamp or something to get off me.
How did you kill him?
I don't remember how I killed him.
Omaima does remember bits of the gory events that followed.
I did all this in 2 hours. Chopped him up pieces in 2 hours.
Chopped you up, Bill, in 2 hours?
Yeah. And all I remember that his head was flying from his body, hit the ceiling up there, and made a blood in the ceiling. And I fall asleep, and I get up in the morning, and I found the trash bags, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what happened.
She said that she heard voices. The Egyptian gods were helping her, telling her things.
She was telling me that who killed, he must die. Who killed, he killed. And she turned around and she walked away. And the next when I get up, I checked, I find my name and his name was written by blood in the mirror. It said me and you.
What was written in blood?
Me and you.
Did you cook some parts of Bill before you wrapped him up in the plastic?
No, I'm not really eater much either. I don't eat meat.
You don't eat meat?
No, I don't eat the meat.
You're a vegetarian?
Vegetarian, yes.
She would go from voices, I'm hearing people from the dead telling me these things, and Bill's head's here, and he's cut up, and there's body parts all over this place. She didn't really confess to anything other than she blacked out, she heard voices, there was a phone call, somebody said, look in the freezer, look in the trash bags. It didn't make any sense. There's no continuity to this thing. She was all over the map.
Well, I think you're telling me part of the truth, but not all of it.
Well, I think I need to talk to the psychiatrist to just see the last of my mind.
We kind of sized her up as somebody that was just grasping at straws, trying to work herself out of this bad situation.
Following the interrogation, investigators get word that the coroner has positively identified the remains as Bill Nelson.
The coroner's office made a notification to next of kin. Bill's wife in Santa Maria, California was notified. He also had a son in Los Angeles.
I hate it for the family that has to even live through this because it's horrible. And truly, it is your worst nightmare.
Following her arrest, Omaima meets with multiple mental health professionals. Her story changes again and takes a shocking turn.
She was also able to provide gruesome details about the things that she did to her husband. Some of these details include dismembering her husband, boiling her husband, deep frying parts of his body.
She talked about cooking her husband, that his ribs tasted sweet. She put barbecue sauce on them and things of that nature.
That's strange. And not only strange, that is insane.
Investigators consider whether Omaima is telling the truth or setting up her defense.
It was really hard to believe that that happened. It really was.
Like one line, she was trying to say self-defense. The other line, she was trying to say criminal insanity.
It was obvious that she would throw things out, see what stuck.
Omaima's attorneys hire their own expert. In interviews, Dr. Nancy Kaiser-Boyd delves into Omaima's upbringing in Egypt.
She had a terrible childhood. She'd been sexually assaulted. Her father often beat her, and her stepmother there beat her also.
In addition to her stressful home environment, she lived in a culture during a time where female circumcision was very popular, and so this is something that she experienced very young, at 7 years old.
They took her to a dark place. She remembered it was 3 older women. Her mother wasn't there. She thought they were killing her. She described extraordinary pain and fear, and then she became unconscious. She didn't wake until her mother came and touched her. And by that time, she told me that they were preparing for her burial because they thought she was dead.
In your home country, and then you move to a foreign country, you don't realize how much control and presence you have in your own life. In your home country, you know the language, you know the slang, you know the scary neighborhoods, you know the players that you want to stay away from. I imagine this is Omaima's experience. She met this oil worker who could offer her a better life, and they fell in love very quickly. They married, and then they moved to the United States. When you live in a place where there's a lot of violence and poverty, with the history that she's had, and she has an opportunity to move on and move to a different country where she doesn't have to face feeling objectified every single day of her life, who wouldn't want to move? She quickly realized that her American dream was not going to be what she thought it was going to be. She has to rely on another person the same way she was relying on other people in her previous country, and she has to rely on a man to do everything for her. And I imagine that was the exact...
Omaima Nelson is behind bars. Accused of brutally dismembering her husband of just a few weeks. In interviews with a psychologist, Omaima reveals she suffered sexual abuse, violence, and female circumcision.
We had her examined by a gynecologist, and that doctor told us that her vaginal area had a lot of scar tissue and that sex would be very painful for her.
During the trial prep, Omaima's defense team, her attorney and investigator, actually flew to this suburb of Cairo and did in-depth interviews of her family members and to kind of give a glimpse of her childhood growing up and possibly the abuses involved, to show that she'd had a series of dominating males in her life and that she'd experienced not only the circumcision but sexual assault. And so there was definitely some aspects of her past that they were trying to show contributed to this murder.
Detectives and prosecutors prepare to counter whatever defense Omaima brings to court. They speak with medical professionals who examined Omaima on the day of her arrest.
The hospital report concluded that there were no signs of rape or sexual assault.
She also mentioned that she was the one who had been held down and tied to this bedpost. No ligature marks at all around her wrists or her ankles. In fact, medical professionals said she had cuts on her, cuts that came from when she was stabbing Bill.
Investigators reach out to Bill's family, including his ex-wives.
Bill was very acquainted with family and his children. His kids would call him on a fairly regular basis, and yeah, he was just a great dad.
When I spoke to Bill's ex-wife, she spoke very fondly of Bill. And I was struck at one point that she really liked this guy. And she was deeply hurt by what happened to him.
In talking to the family, it was obvious that Bill Nelson was not a violent person. No evidence of that.
Investigators find no record of violence or abuse on Bill's behalf. Omaima is a different story.
One incident included her going to the pharmacy and grabbing whatever she wanted out of there and stealing without paying for this stuff. 2 security guards were watching her, and when they tried to stop her, she got extremely violent with them, so much so she ended up attacking them so viciously that she bit the chest of one of the women, the female security guards. She bit her breast so hard that she almost bit it off, and she also grabbed the vagina of the security guard as well.
As news of the gruesome crime spreads across the state, law enforcement gets a phone call.
Robert Hansen saw the news report of Omaima's crimes against Bill Nelson.
Mr. Robert Hansen, elderly, single, lived in an apartment, fairly successful business person. He met Omaima in a bar, and over conversation, one thing led to another, and she went home with him. Obviously, there was a relationship that started.
At one point during their relationship, they were having sex, and they were doing what she likes to call kinky sex.
She gets over there and ties him up, but instead of doing the kinky sexual thing that she promised, she attempted to rob him and pulls a gun on him. The defendant didn't tie the restraints tight enough because Robert was able to get free and escape from her. But he was so embarrassed that he never called the police. But once he saw the report in the news of Bill Nelson, he had to come forward. He couldn't keep silent because she had done something similar to him and he survived. So this wasn't Omaima's first rodeo.
Bill Nelson's body. His wife, Omaima, is set to stand trial.
When the case goes to trial, December 1992, prosecutors immediately try to paint Omaima as this woman who wanted this lavish lifestyle that she was promised by Bill Nelson, and she was entitled to get this lifestyle.
Omaima Nelson was an ex-model, beautiful woman of Egyptian descent, very attractive, and she would seek out older men to fleece them for their money.
Bill was talking about being wealthy and owning a cattle ranch and having money, which fit right into what she was looking for. She was looking for another sugar daddy.
Following their whirlwind romance and wedding, a different truth emerged.
Things started to fall apart a little bit. She realized that Bill wasn't the man that he might be saying he is. He didn't have that cattle ranch. It became real to her that Bill had purported himself to be something other than he was.
The things that Bill promised her and the lifestyle that she thought she was going to live was all a lie. Bill didn't have any money, and she wanted payback.
On Thanksgiving Day, tensions were high, and Mr. Nelson found himself tied to a bed.
She immobilized him under a false pretext. Probably hit him with the iron. Several times, about 30 times. The iron broke during this assault. Lamp was used, also broken. And then he was stabbed too. Then started cutting him up.
From November 28th till December 1st, she completely destroyed her husband's body.
Next door neighbor, when he interviewed him, he said he was able to hear through their common wall chopping and the sink running and the garbage disposal running, to the point where he believed that the garbage disposal had given up. This activity went on through the early morning hours, quite prolonged.
Prosecutors also call Robert Hansen to the stand.
So Robert's story shows the defendant's modus operandi, and he became a star witness in the prosecution's case against her, showing that she had previously tried to do this to someone else.
Omima's attorneys do not attempt an insanity plea.
Her lawyer argued that this was self-defense or imperfect self-defense, which is a sudden belief that you need to defend yourself by killing the other person.
Dr. Kaiser Boyd takes the stand.
What she told me was that he had her tied to the bed, and he was sitting on top of her, and he was angry, and he had his pocket knife out, and he was cutting her on the breasts. And she, as you can imagine, cutting is a trigger for someone who's had genital circumcision, so she flipped out. And she got loose, and she started hitting him with a lamp by the bed. She jumped up and grabbed an iron that was in the room. And started beating him with that. She said he fell on the bed, and she stabbed him with scissors. She cut him up because she didn't want him to be able to enter the afterlife. The reason Egyptians wrapped their dead and mummified them was so they could enter heaven whole. She told me she hoped she never, if she got to heaven, she would never see him there.
Omima took the stand herself to testify in this case. And she began to share with them in a very emotional, heartfelt testimony about, first of all, her life and the continuous abuse and the trauma and the pain.
She was a victim of sexual assault, of child abuse, of female genital mutilation, and all of this trauma, like cumulatively over the years, contributed to her psychological stressors that caused her to do this.
The jury deliberates for 6 days.
I was on needles and pins. I didn't know what the outcome would be.
Ultimately, they came and found her guilty with second-degree murder, and she received 25 years to life.
But Omima's story doesn't end with the verdict.
While in prison, Omima meets another older gentleman that's rich. And that relationship began to flourish. They became married. However, during the marriage, her husband dies, but he also leaves her with a lot of money. And now she's up for parole in 2026, and she may get her dream to finally live the American dream.
The life that she lived was brutal, and it's very clear to me that it followed her everywhere that she went.
I understand her anger. However, it does not justify the gruesome, horrible, horrific crime that she committed. She doesn't deserve to be free. I don't think you can rehabilitate evil.
Bensonhurst, New York is known as the Little Italy of Brooklyn. It's a neighborhood that carries with it a deep sense of pride, tradition, and heritage. But in the 1980s, those same qualities gave Bensonhurst a reputation as a racist community, particularly toward African Americans. And in August of 1989, long simmering racial tensions erupt in a night of bloodshed, leaving teenager Yusef Hawkins dead at the hands of a white mob.
Sir, what is your name? Joseph Farmer.
The hunt for his killer will send police into a standoff with organized crime. Meanwhile, Brooklyn's black community rises up to lead the most explosive protest in city history, demanding justice for Yusef and taking a sharp bite out of the Big Apple's reputation as America's melting pot. Bensonhurst is situated in southwest Brooklyn, just a stone's throw away from the glitz and glamour of Manhattan. Yet it feels like a world away.
Bensonhurst is part of Brooklyn. Brooklyn is part of New York City, so it's not rural, it's not remote, nothing luxurious. It is a middle-class working neighborhood.
The community was settled by Italian immigrants in the mid-20th century.
They call it the Little Italy of Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, and it was. Basically, it was an Italian area from back in the 50s. And how it happens is, they get off the boat and they follow each other around. You stick with your own kind. The restaurants are great. The food is phenomenal. The clothing stores, we like our Italian. We like to look good. During the Saturday Night Fever era, that's all Bensonhurst guys.
By 1989, Bensonhurst had become a close-knit neighborhood filled with working families.
On Sundays, they would close this 4-lane street down and play stickball and music and barbecue and everybody making the sauce.
It was considered a very safe neighborhood.
But this safety came at a cost.
When you think Italian, it's kind of stereotypical, but you think about the mafia, right? But this is true in this scenario. It was a mob town.
A lot of the people in the neighborhood at that time credited the mob with keeping it a safe neighborhood. The suggestion was that if somebody were to try something here in Bensonhurst, something would happen to them.
However, protection was only available to Bensonhurst Italian residents. Others, especially those who looked different, were shunned.
Bensonhurst was a predominantly Italian white neighborhood, and many people who lived there viewed African Americans as being the source of all of our urban problems. And they didn't want black people living in their neighborhood, shopping in their neighborhood, driving through their neighborhood.
Bensonhurst was very provincial in this way. If you were a black person walking down the street in Bensonhurst, and if you were walking past the wrong business, like certain social clubs, back then it would not be unusual for 1 or 2 people to stop you and say, "Where are you going? What are you doing here?"
And this attitude extended well beyond Bensonhurst borders.
Bensonhurst wasn't alone. There are many other neighborhoods throughout the city where we find the same attitudes. New York in general was like the melting pot that will not melt.
New York is segregated and racist. This is the New York we're talking about. The Big Apple never gave us a bite.
And over time, segregation set the stage for bloodshed.
During that period of time, there were several racially motivated murders.
In 1986, Willie Turks, for example, was the MTA driver who got pulled out of a car and, killed by a white mob. And then in 1989, the Central Park 5 was also going on.
It's a symptom, right? But it tells us that there is an undercurrent of hatred and hostility amongst the races.
So New York was a divided New York, and of course all that exploded on August 23rd, 1989.
Shortly after 9 p.m. on that fateful night, the NYPD's 62nd Precinct receives a panicked 911 call.
Police, Bailey Avenue and 20th Avenue. Somebody just got shot. Somebody just got shot. A bunch of white boys just shot a black guy. They were on foot? Yeah, on foot. A bunch of white boys. Thank you. Police will be there.
When police get the call, they're immediately on edge.
I got the chills because it was a bunch of white kids who jumped a bunch of black kids. And I said, let's go and pack a bag because it's going to be a long one. And sure enough, it was.
Police arrive at the scene and find a young black man has been shot multiple times in the chest.
He was bleeding profusely. An emergency medical service ambulance was dispatched to the scene. And the medics on board the ambulance tried to do what they could to give initial first aid. The scene at that point was kind of pandemonium.
The victim's 3 friends are also at the scene, and they identify him as 16-year-old East New York resident Yusef Hawkins.
He was taken to a hospital nearby, and the doctors began their work. They knew they had their work cut out for them.
Yusef Hawkins was born and raised in the predominantly black neighborhood of East New York in Brooklyn.
Yusef and his friends were normal kids, go to school, do their homework, ride their bike around the neighborhood. Just a sort of a normal kind of life that they were living as young people at the time.
His family, loved him. He was just a beautiful person, had a sense of humor, and very sensitive to people's feelings and suffering and stuff like that.
He was just like a really well-rounded kid, played a lot of sports, hung out a lot with his friends in the community.
Yusef had plans to attend Transit Tech, a vocational school in East New York. After graduating, he dreamed of becoming a technical engineer.
He wanted to be a subway motorman. His words, according to his mother, had been, I want to drive the train. And he did well in school.
He was ambitious. He was extremely intelligent.
So how did this promising young man end up shot on the streets of Bensonhurst?
He wasn't participating in anything that would make sense of this story,
He was just a typical New York City teenager. He was not in trouble with the law in any way at all.
As detectives questioned Yusef's friends, they learned the group had traveled to Bensonhurst that evening to buy a used car.
They saw an ad, they were interested in buying a car, and they were going to go and look at it.
Brooklyn is a big place, and going to Bensonhurst was a place that he had never been, his friends had never been. They might as well have been going to Rhode Island. It was an adventure, and when they got out of the subway in Bensonhurst, they had become lost, and they continued to walk. There were no cell phones in those days. They were trying to get directions by looking at a map.
They just walked down a street they'd never been on before, in a neighborhood they'd never been to before, with this illusion of feeling secure when they absolutely were not. They were walking into an incredibly lethal situation.
From their perspective, they had reached a place where there was a schoolyard, where there were a number, like a large number, of white kids who were hanging around there.
Yusef's friends say that the crowd of 20 to 30 white men began following them and yelling racial slurs and threatening them with baseball bats.
You can imagine the fear. It's like, why are these people saying these things? Why are they harassing me? Why are they threatening to do bodily harm? Why are there baseball bats? I'm sure there was a lot of fear that came upon them in a very short amount of time.
The crowd surrounds Yusef and his friends outside of a store.
They had nowhere to run.
Detectives learned that a young white man emerged from the crowd and fired several shots into Yusef's chest. At the sound of gunshots, the mob scattered.
We know that 3 shots found their way into Yusuf Hawkins's chest. Yusuf collapsed onto the sidewalk. He was still clutching a Snickers bar.
Yusuf's friends say the men that attacked them were strangers. They have no idea why they were targeted, other than the color of their skin.
These 3 young men didn't pose a threat to anybody. They weren't provocative. They were there minding their own business. They were baby-faced boys. They weren't men. They had no idea what they were walking into.
And by the very next morning, all hell will break loose.
This was a different type of situation, and what none of us knew was how this was going to affect New York City as a whole.
The New York City Police Department is investigating the shooting of 16-year-old Yusuf Hawkins in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn. Detectives have reason to believe this was a racially motivated attack.
Early reports was that there was a large group of young men that had congregated in a schoolyard where they surrounded 3 young black men who had walked into the neighborhood. And from there was a shooting.
In the chaotic aftermath, Yusuf was rushed to an area hospital.
He was bleeding profusely. He was taken to a hospital nearby, and the doctors began their work.
The surgeon who opened his chest at Kings County Hospital and tried to repair the heart, and he said that Yusuf's heart literally fell apart in his hands.
It was a murder. It was tragic. It was a murder.
Within hours of the shooting, Yusuf's murder is front-page news.
When the incident first happened, it was something that you saw on the 11 o'clock news. And the New York Daily News, the New York Post.
The information that got out was this was a young man who was black, who was shot by a white person after being pursued by a bat-wielding mob of white young men.
As word spreads, community members question why Yusuf would ever set foot in Bensonhurst.
It was kind of like whispered amongst other black people, like, you know, we don't go over there, you know, it's not too safe over there, because they don't like black people. They don't treat black people very well.
Older people have fear and say, hey, you need to not venture into those areas. So I think Yusuf knew that there was potential danger, but I think that he was insistent upon being a human being that should be allowed to walk wherever I please and buy a car wherever I want to buy a car. And unfortunately, it cost him his life.
At the scene, detectives search for potential witnesses.
This is 1989, so we didn't have video cameras on every pole, and there was not a lot of forensic evidence, and the police will start to canvass houses, which means they'll go door to door, knocking on doors, ringing doorbells, asking people proactively, did you see anything, did you hear anything, what do you know?
There's always that little lady that looks out the window. There's always that nosy guy who's taking out the garbage. You gotta find him. So I went to 123 68th Street, and Mr. Smith didn't see anything. But Mr. Bond downstairs heard the shots, looked outside, saw a bunch of kids running.
The witness says he had seen several of the kids before, hanging outside a local candy shop.
There was this candy store, it was called Sal's Snacks and Candies, run by a guy who they referred to as Sal Squid or Mr. Squid. And there was a collage on the wall in there. The collage was just random pictures of neighborhood characters that were slapped on a piece of oak tag. I'm sure that it was cool to have your picture up there.
It was a collage of a whole bunch of the neighborhood kids who were at the schoolyard.
It was like a photo lineup on steroids. So the detectives took that collage and they used it sort of as a photo array to identify potential suspects.
Detectives asked area residents if any of these teenagers were part of the mob that attacked Yusuf.
They found who they could from that group. If they didn't know the name, they talked to people who would give them the name.
Huge step forward. A huge step forward. If we didn't have that collage, I'd probably still be out in the street looking for guys.
Just as the investigation starts to gain traction, though, residents of Bensonhurst close ranks around their own.
What happened was, I find you. I need your son. Okay, then your son's being held. You call up his best friend's father and say, listen, don't let them take him because my son's collared.
People in the neighborhood, telephone, telegraph, tell a neighbor, were quick to tell other people, hey, the cops are arresting everybody. They're questioning everybody. Tell your son to take a ride to Manhattan.
But as Bensonhurst shuts down, Brooklyn heats up.
It hit the media, and I was so livid. I was so angry. Not another one.
Here you had a kid who was murdered, 16-year-old little boy who played basketball, who loved to ride his bike. You had him murdered.
The energy from our black community was at the highest pitch level it could possibly ever be. Everybody was angry and fired up.
I think that people were outraged and they were willing to die. I think that is what everyone felt. They felt like their son had died and they were willing to die.
The community rose up and said, oh no, this is not 1889, this is 1989. We don't do that anymore. But as the days went on, prominent folks in the African American community began to rise up and say what happened here was a grave injustice. We cannot allow this kind of violence to go on because then our city will go up in flames.
The public response was immediate. The city was boiling over, and within a short period of time, white people and black people began to mobilize.
We need to go to Bensonhurst and make them feel uncomfortable just how we feel uncomfortable every single day. We need to go and stand for what we believe in. We need to go fight for black lives because if not, they're gonna keep killing us.
Murder of 16-year-old Yusef Hawkins in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn has sparked widespread anger and exposed an ugly truth about New York City.
The reason for the visceral public reaction, in particular in the black community, was the fact that he was not armed. You know, he and his friends, they weren't going there to pick a fight. They were going there to look at a car. And so the fact that he was on an ordinary errand and wound up losing his life, that is what caused people to feel so much outrage.
And to make matters worse, attacks like the one against Yusef were not just isolated to Bensonhurst. They were happening throughout the city.
So in the 80s, there was huge racial tensions in New York.
So if you look at that time frame, many incidents of black folks, you know, getting killed, you know, either by the police or, you know, by angry white folks. And so you did have sort of that backdrop to what happened with Yusef.
In 1982, Willie Turks was walking in his car in Gravesend, not far from Bensonhurst, white community in Brooklyn. They snatch him out of his car, kill him.
Also, a few years prior to this, you had a mob that had chased Michael Griffith to his death on the Belt Parkway.
Then we have the incident with Bernard Goetz on the subway, which was a huge media frenzy. It had a white man shooting several black youths on a subway car. 1989 was an extraordinary year because we also had the Central Park 5, where you had a white woman that was raped, and they settled on this narrative about these black youths, and we now know that it was a lie.
This cycle keeps continuing to happen over and over. The same traumatic stories just done in different ways. And so I think that a lot of people were starting to see that whenever our children leave our community, they're not safe. They're either being accused of something or they're being killed. So there was a lot of racial tension going on.
Race relations, it was simmering. It was simmering. And it took just one incident to sort of, you know, blow the whole pot off, the simmering tensions.
Given recent history, Brooklyn's black community decides enough is enough.
If we don't take matters into our own hands and protect us and protect our own children, who's gonna do it? Who's gonna do it?
So now you got young black people and old black people stepping out to the forefront saying no more. And there was this energy out here in black leadership during that time, galvanized it and pointed it in the right direction.
One of the most vocal leaders of the movement is Reverend Al Sharpton, who organizes numerous marches from Yusef's East New York neighborhood straight into the belly of the beast in Bensonhurst.
In 1955, it was Martin Luther King. In 1987, it was Al Sharpton. He led the first riot into Bensonhurst. And he marched black folks into that neighborhood.
Hundreds of protesters turned out for the march, including City Councilman and Black Panther Charles Barrett.
I said, hey, I'm not gonna sit here angry. We gotta turn this pain to power. Okay, this march, it was the threat that you will not be in peace as long as you're allowing your neighbor and your system to oppress us like this. No, you're not gonna live in peace.
I had been invited by Reverend Sharpton to come along on the first march. I remember young men in the back of the bus with a boombox who were playing Fight the Power by Public Enemy. But there were elder people. There were one or two mothers with strollers. These were people that we would not see at demonstrations of this type in New York City under normal circumstances. But to these people, Yusuf Hawkins was their child.
In Bensonhurst, a chilling sight awaits the protesters.
It's like a powder keg out here. The tension, you can cut it with a knife. I remember marching and seeing how our community was so fired up. And then the response, the reception, you thought you were in the South. I couldn't believe my eyes. A wedding party came with the groom and their maids of honor, whatever, on the corner to call us the N-word. A wedding party.
All of a sudden, it didn't feel like Brooklyn anymore. It felt like Mississippi. It felt like Alabama. I remember Reverend Sharpton being asked by a reporter, do you think there might be violence? Reverend Sharpton said to her, there's already been violence. Yusuf is dead. But the marchers remained peaceful. This was an amazingly peaceful demonstration for 600 people who were afraid for their children, afraid for themselves.
Al Sharpton was a beast. He went and marched in Bensonhurst 20 times.
But as the rallies continue, Reverend Sharpton is attacked, just 1 block from where Yusuf was shot.
Everything just snowballed. Sharpton gets stabbed by an Italian kid with a knife.
Sharpton is rushed to a hospital, but survives his injuries. And in the days and weeks that follow, he continues to drive the movement, even while he heals.
I seriously do not think that Reverend Al Sharpton has ever gotten enough credit. He was the spokesman for an urban civil rights movement.
But as Sharpton's movement rages on the streets, detectives are working the case, and one name has risen to the top of the suspect list.
There was a young man who was a little bit of an up-and-comer, ended up saying some things and doing some things that led to the death of Yusuf Hawkins.
As white residents clash with black protesters over the murder of Yusuf Hawkins, his family steps back from the fray to mourn his loss.
There was a large crowd of people who were gathered at the funeral home.
I looked at the people at the funeral, how sad they were, how angry they were, how frustrated they were. And if that could happen to him, it could happen to any one of us.
Meanwhile, in Bensonhurst, police are shaking down witnesses for information.
You're looking at a mob of 35 kids. And of course, everybody in Bensonhurst who had any connection to any of these people knew exactly what happened and who was involved. So there was no shortage of people to talk to.
Surprisingly, every witness gives the same name.
During the cultivating of the witnesses, the one kid that everyone was talking about was Keith Mondella.
According to witnesses, Keith Mondella was not just a member of the mob that attacked Yusuf, he was the reason it formed in the first place. So detectives called Keith in for questioning.
he was, acting like most kids from the neighborhood. I don't talk to the cops. So I kind of said, listen, when you go to Rikers, you're going to be a part of a group that murdered a black boy. You're not going to make it in there. You're going to be somebody's girlfriend. And he broke. And that's when we found out what it was about.
According to Keith, the trouble all started with a girl named Gina.
He had started a relationship with a young lady by the name of Gina Feliciano. She moved in upstairs above the store where they hung out. And he started a physical relationship with her.
The Gina and Keith situation is something that people in the neighborhood had varying things to say about. And some of their comments were directed very badly at Gina and her virtue.
She was just a plaything for Keith.
According to Keith, Gina flew into a rage after learning she wasn't the only woman in his life.
They told us there was going to be a party, which she expected him to attend with her, and he said, no, I have a girlfriend. And with that, she got very upset. She got insulted by that. And she said, my brother is coming down tonight with his friends to get you.
She told him he's going to bring some of his friends with him who are also black, and they're going to beat the crap out of Keith and his friends.
So one boy tells another, another tells another, and before you know it, that night, there's 20, 24 kids on the corner gonna protect and defend their friend Keith because these guys are coming.
They were waiting for, as one of them put it, black kids to come. And in their mind, there was going to be trouble.
And once Yusef and his friends arrived on that street corner, the witnesses are all in agreement about what happened next.
You've got a bunch of young men with golf clubs and bats waiting in a schoolyard for people they believed were going to make trouble. They saw three people who, in their minds, fit the description of these people they thought were coming.
The white teenagers, they didn't have a specific target. They didn't have a name. They just had a skin color. And so when they saw Yusef and his friends, they just assumed that it was those boys.
Yusef and his friends found themselves surrounded by a group of white kids. They were penned in, walled in, whatever you want to say. They had no place to go. And they just parted like the Red Sea. The gunman raised his hand and shot Yusef Hawkins in the chest.
The witnesses say Keith Mondello didn't fire that weapon, and neither did they.
He was like, I didn't shoot him. I didn't want this. This is not what, I didn't want this.
Given the racial undertones of the case, the district attorney decides to prosecute to the fullest extent of the law.
And a decision was made, if a person had a bat, that person would be charged with murder, because in this case, the fact that these young men were unable to move from where they were, they couldn't run, they couldn't hide, and so whoever was there with a bat would have been as responsible for Yusef Hawkins' death as the young man who had the gun.
The NYPD rounds up almost a dozen members of the bat-wielding mob.
The names that came up pretty quickly were John Vento, Steve Carreri, and Charlie Stressler, who was the player who brought the baseball bats, helped to whip up the crowd and distribute those bats to the young men that were there waiting to join the fight.
But the gunman himself remains at large.
They wanted the gunman, but nobody was giving him up. Everybody was deaf and dumb. Everybody was like, no, I didn't see that part of it. I ran away. So knowing who the gunman was the big puzzle. And for NYPD, it was the big pride.
Weeks after the murder of Yusef Hawkins, protesters continue to flood the streets of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn.
I think the reason why Bensonhurst became ground zero for activism was because black people was fed up.
It's just not going to be business as usual. You disrupted our life, we're disrupting yours. Nobody should be resting in peace for what you did to Yusef Hawkins. So that's why it was important for us to keep going.
My fire was ignited. Like, I hated racism, right? I hated anybody who participated in racism. I wanted my people to thrive, to survive, to like overcome.
As the protests continue, New York City investigators work to find the alleged gunman.
You're taking a 17, 18-year-old kid and you're telling him, you're going to jail for murder. I didn't do it. Well, who did? And that's how it came about. Guys were saying, well, this guy Joey Fama, he's not part of our crew, but somebody brought him along.
Detectives dig into Joey Fama's background, learning he keeps dangerous company.
Joey had mob connections.
The kid, Fama, comes from a hard knock family. They were connected. They were heavy into drugs. They owned a construction company. Yeah, they were tough.
There was this traffic accident when he was a boy, which he was injured, and the injury was to his head. He was considered to be very slow.
Joey Fama is not, he's no rocket scientist. You know what Joey Fama reminded me of? There's a wise guy out there, he's in jail now. Gas Pipe Castillo. I don't think he's got the intelligence of a squirrel, but he was vicious.
But there's just one problem. Joey Fama has disappeared.
Well, we do know that he went into hiding.
So, police flood every street in Bensonhurst, which spells trouble for the mob, who all but run the community.
The NYPD started busting down doors of Gambino family card games. Usually it got left alone. Not this time. The heat was on. The detectives wanted somebody to give up this person who shot Yusuf Hawkins.
And as police conduct raids, protesters continue to swarm the area, bringing with them more unwanted attention.
The mafia was out there trying to tell everybody to be cool so the demonstrations could eventually stop and they can go back to business as usual.
Finally, after weeks of chaos, the mafia decides hiding Joey Fama is bad for business.
He brought so much heat on the neighborhood.
Sammy the Bull had a meeting with the people in the neighborhood at his pool hall. And during this meeting, told the kids and some other mob-inclined people that Joey Fama could be given up, that was okay with him.
These demonstrations had impact, had economic impact, had social impact on that community, and it worked, and they gave him up.
On August 31st, 1989, authorities take Fama into custody.
Joey Fama was in upstate New York at that time, and he ended up surrendering to the police. There was no drama.
Joseph Fama.
Fama is charged with murder. He pleads not guilty.
Nobody pled out in this case. Everybody went to trial.
But for New York's black citizens, the fight for justice is only beginning. Over the next few months, the politics of race will take center stage, and Yusuf's death will open the door for New York's first black mayor, David Dinkins.
Mayor Dinkins ran on the heels of a rebellion. They ran saying that they were going to get justice for black people, that they were going to clean up the city and get things right.
Hatred. He was an unarmed kid being chased by someone with a gun.
Racism.
That hate and disrespect for black bodies was next level.
They're trying to keep us from telling our story.
Stories will be told. Truth revealed.
I just couldn't imagine losing my 17.
Black people stepping out to the forefront, saying no more. And there was this energy out here, and black leadership during that time galvanized it.
When Yusuf was killed, Ed Koch was the mayor of New York City. And after the death of Yusuf, people were not all that happy with his performance.
This is not a community that should be described as a racist community.
Mayor Koch backed down and said, hey, this is not a racist community. The next day, we the people are out there marching, and they're calling us Starface, threatening us, throwing things.
As protests in Bensonhurst rage on, 8 young men have been arrested for Yusuf Hawkins' murder.
If we look at what occurred that night, the mob chases Yusuf and his friends. There were guys with bats. There were guys with golf clubs. They're at the mercy of this mob. And that's when Joey Fama moves forward and shoots Yusef. And so all those people with the bats acting in concert with the shooter.
It couldn't have happened without the cooperation of others. So we charged 8 different people with murder.
On April 2nd, 1990, the trial begins for the alleged gunman, Joey Fama.
Joey Fama's story was essentially that he was not the shooter. He didn't say, if that was the case, who the shooter was.
Prosecutors call witnesses to the stand to refute Joey's story, that he wasn't the shooter. Among them is another Bensonhurst teenager named Frankie Tye. But Frankie's testimony comes with risks.
Part of the trial of Joseph Fama relied on testimony from Frankie Tye, who was a young kid who had changed his story on some things, was under psychiatric care. Not a great witness, according to Joey's attorney, but who nonetheless had told the story at the trial of Joey Fama shooting Yusef Hawkins.
On May 17th, 1990, the jury returns a verdict. Fama is found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to over 32 years in prison.
One guy that I would never let out of jail. Never. He stole a bar of soap. Give him 5 more years. You know what I mean? Because that one guy ruined so many lives. Ruined so many things.
Keith Mondello, the teen whose ill-fated romance sparked the mob violence, is also tried for murder.
Their suggestion had been, if you didn't have Keith Mondello, you didn't have 35, 40 hyped up young men gathering in a schoolyard with baseball bats and golf clubs. And so Keith was largely blamed for this having occurred at all.
In May 1990, Keith is acquitted of murder, but convicted on a slew of other charges, including riot, unlawful imprisonment, and possession of a weapon. He is sentenced to 5.5 to 16 years in prison, but ultimately serves 8 before being paroled.
The ringleader, the one who brought everybody together, got 8 years. 8 years? People get 8 years for stealing something, not for organizing a lynch mob to kill somebody.
Of the 8 teens brought to trial in Yusef's murder, only 4 end with convictions.
These were really difficult cases because nobody wanted to cooperate. It was like pulling teeth, having witnesses disappear, having witnesses go hostile on us. So we had a mix of convictions and acquittals.
And though it feels like injustice to many, Yusef's story continues echoing across the city. In fact, he helped change New York political history.
In 1989, Ed Koch was seeking a 4th term as mayor of New York City. His main primary challenger was David Dinkins, who was African American. So for David Dinkins, he was trying to become the first black mayor in the history of New York City. One of the things that people were saying was Ed Koch doesn't care about black folks. He's not out there saying this is wrong. Now, David Dinkins wasn't hollering and screaming about Yusef Hawkins, but he was speaking in a way that resonated with people. He was speaking with compassion and with sympathy.
What I'd like to talk about is how we need to bring our city together.
After defeating Ed Koch in the city's Democratic primary race, David Dinkins won the city's mayoral election in November 1989.
So this is what the legacy of Yusef Hawkins left. He was great in life. He was a beautiful person in life, but he was even greater in death, that he presented a symbol of assertiveness, a symbol of, I'll go wherever I want to go, a symbol of, in spite of all of this racism, wasn't infected by the disease we're fighting against. I was a good man, and I loved human beings. And for that, we are eternally grateful to the family and the spirit of Yusef Hawkins. Bensonhurst is different now. I think it's largely Asian and white. Now the Asian community might be larger in Bensonhurst now.
If you go back It was like these folks were hollering and screaming and yelling, trying to preserve something that was dying anyway. The vast majority of white America did not ascribe to the views that were being expressed by these folks. And if you look at Bensonhurst today, that sentiment is not there anymore. Not there anymore at all.
Las Vegas, Nevada is known as the ultimate playground for adults, full of casinos, nightlife, and world-renowned stage acts. But it's also a city that became synonymous with corruption, intrigue, and vice. In 1971, the death of one of its most famous residents sparked a controversial investigation that would leave everyone wondering what really happened. The Las Vegas Strip is one of the most iconic and recognizable locations in America, lined with storied hotels and casinos. In recent years, Vegas has attempted to shed its image of debauchery for something more family-friendly. But during the 1960s, it was a hotspot for entertainer, casino, and hotel in 1946, and the mob soon took over.
It was definitely a mob town. It was their playground. And that's why they got all these great entertainers, because they control almost all the nightclubs in the country. They could afford to pay these nightclub entertainers what you would pay a movie star, because they had not only the ticket sales, but the subsidy from casino gambling.
This was the perfect setting to see them running portions of the boxing industry.
Boxing is very lucrative, first of all. That's one of the reasons why the mob gets involved. But secondly, I think that just maybe boxers are attracted by mob guys, and mob guys are attracted by fighters.
Up until the 60s, Madison Square Garden was the main stage for professional boxing. But it would find a new home, 2,500 miles away, in the desert of Nevada.
Some of the casinos put up money to host this heavyweight championship fight in Las Vegas in 1963, the first title fight ever held in Las Vegas.
For a city built on gambling, boxing was a perfect match. The casinos soon took control, inventing the phenomenon of big-budget title fights. And in December of 1969, there was a lot of money riding on the highly anticipated comeback match for ex-heavyweight champion Sonny Liston.
Sonny Liston was considered the Mike Tyson of the 1960s.
Sonny Liston is my idol as a fighter. He had to beat all the best contenders to get the people to take him seriously, to accept him.
Only 2 minutes and 22 seconds have elapsed.
He did it on effort alone. December of 69, takes a fight with Leotis Martin here in Las Vegas. About that, everybody thinks he's going to win.
But no one could have predicted that it would be the beginning of the end of Liston's complicated and tumultuous life story. On January 5th, 1971, Sonny's wife Geraldine and son Daniel returned home to Las Vegas from Christmas vacation with her family.
She actually planned to stay longer, but she became concerned after Sonny stopped answering her phone calls. As soon as Geraldine stepped inside the home, she smelled a rotting smell and thought maybe she had left something in the kitchen. But when she stepped into the bedroom, she discovered Sonny's decomposing body.
It was obvious he was dead. She called the sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department called homicide. When I got to the scene, Geraldine Liston had already left the scene, because I guess she was quite traumatized.
38-year-old Sonny had always been a mountain of a man, with enough power to shatter his opponents. So, what could have happened?
We knew he was past his prime, but he was a relatively young guy, and it was a shock. It was unbelievable that this could have happened.
He was laying in bed. It was a real pretty bad odor. It was really disturbing. because he was one of my heroes as a kid. I'll never forget that.
Charles Sonny Liston was born to a family of sharecroppers on a cotton plantation in Arkansas during the Great Depression. Since the state did not require birth certificates, the exact date of his birth became the first of many mysteries that defined his life.
There's some question about his actual birth date, whether it was 1932 or a couple years before. But either way, we know that Sonny Liston was born essentially during the Great Depression. Liston is born in tragedy. I mean, from the beginning, born to, a large tenant farming family in rural Arkansas. I mean, the likelihood that which you're able to meet your full potential, the odds are just so far against it.
In 1946, a hard winter left the family struggling to get by. But when his mother left to find work in St. Louis, Sonny ran away from home to follow her.
The father beat him every day. Sonny was the biggest child. He would get the most beatings. There were scars on his face. There were scars on his arm. And of course, he left the father because this was like a childhood from Dickens or Dostoevsky, where there were beatings and hard work.
Once reunited with his mother in St. Louis, Sonny adapted to life on the streets to make ends meet.
He still has no formal education, right? So how do you even translate that success into something that is lasting if you would deny what you need to be successful in other ways because you were born Black and poor?
Unfortunately, he assimilated himself into a world of petty criminals.
Over the next 6 years, Sonny was involved in various muggings and robberies.
You live by the sword and you die by the sword. And in them days, there was a lot of tough guys out there, and you get yourself in trouble real easy.
24 arrests in St. Louis, and then he catches the big case. Arrested for essentially strong-arm robbery. And he gets sent to state penitentiary.
While behind bars, 20-year-old Sonny finally discovered his true calling.
There was this notion that the way to rehabilitate young men was through boxing, through this sort of physical competition, exert yourself, right? And that this is the way to teach discipline, and Liston thrives. Liston's involvement with boxing while he's in prison creates for him, for the first time in his life, real opportunities for upward mobility.
He had these great attributes that were there for boxing. He was about 6'1", which is big for the time, but his hands, his fists, which you make your living with in boxing, were disproportionately large. He had an extremely long reach to go along with his physical size. And he had a killer instinct, second to none, and a natural punch.
It wasn't long until the mob came calling. After 2 years in prison, the mob heard about Liston and pulled some strings to get him paroled early.
When he comes out, he assimilates into the mob and the gangster world.
Under control of the mob, he quickly rose through the amateur ranks, winning his first Golden Gloves title in 1952.
He was a brute, a great jab, maybe the greatest of all time. Liston was the ultimate intimidator. He would take his robe off and was heavily muscled, and he could punch. He could punch hard.
He could knock you out with a jab. Foreign guys, they would have had to pay them extra to get in the ring with him because he would just hammer them. You went in with Liston, you put your life in your hands.
They thought that, and I thought also, that I could beat Sonny Liston. I wound up with 71 stitches, a broken nose, and a broken left cheekbone.
Sonny was unstoppable in the ring. But when he wasn't boxing, he couldn't stay out of trouble. Less than 4 years after being paroled from prison, He was arrested for fighting with an officer over a parking ticket.
Police officer comes up, begins to harass him, and it escalates.
Liston ended up breaking the leg of a policeman. It was, a felony. Sonny was going away.
Sonny spent the next 9 months in jail. After his release in 1957, he decided to change his life and married his girlfriend, Geraldine Chambers, in St. Louis.
Geraldine offered this positive force. She offers a degree of comfort constantly, this degree of love that is really kind of an anchor for him.
With Geraldine by his side, Sonny continued to succeed in the boxing world.
Just rolled through the division like a gargantuan steamroller. Every single contender in front of me just blew out of it.
By 1962, Sonny had earned the right to face heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson. The fight lasted only 2.5 minutes. But no matter how well Sonny performed in the ring, boxing fans hated him for his ties to crime.
And he was the champion that nobody wanted.
I remember my boss came up to me and said, I still don't like him because he didn't come out of prison. He had everybody rooting against him.
He never could quite get anybody else to see what he had accomplished. That's the tragedy of his life.
So I think there's something in Liston that just says to hell with it. No matter what, he can't please the public. He remains a pariah no matter what happens with him.
In 1964, Sonny faced a new challenger, a hero of the Rome Olympics named Cassius Clay. The two would fight twice that year, and both bouts were controversial.
I thought Liston was going to beat him. I thought Liston hit too hard.
In their first match, Sonny was accused of cheating, but Clay still managed to win. The rematch took place 9 months later. By then, Clay had changed his name and his image.
He goes into the rematch, claims now Muhammad Ali, with a group that is perceived as a racist group.
The Nation of Islam, there begins to be a little bit of a turn in terms of the appreciation of Liston. People who were like, wait a minute, maybe Liston ain't that bad after all.
But this time, the outcome would be even more shocking.
He knew the only way he could beat Ali would be to knock him out, and the only time he could do that was early. So he chased him, and he threw jabs to set up the right hand, and he missed him. He's off balance. Ali brings the hand down and chops.
Liston goes down with what people would call a phantom punch.
Most people thought he was throwing the fight.
The punch and the fight would live on in infamy and cement the public's negative opinion of Sonny.
Liston completely repulsed everybody. My God, this guy didn't just lose, he quit, or he laid down, or he took a dive. But I think the die was cast for his future in Las Vegas.
In 1969, Sonny would move to Vegas and attempt to make a comeback. But less than a year later, he is found dead. And no one can understand why.
I was in shock.
Who longer held the title belt, but he was still their champion. So, when he's found dead at his home in Paradise Palms, nobody wants to accept it. Instead, they want answers. Investigators find Sonny's body slumped on the bed, with a broken footstool nearby.
He'd been dead 4 or 5 days. He was all bloated. He was laying back. His feet were like on the floor.
How he exactly died is unclear because his body was so decomposed they couldn't determine the cause of death. The police thought maybe he had fallen, which would explain the broken stool. But the coroner learned through the autopsy that he didn't have any head trauma.
His wife, Geraldine, believes he's been killed, but police find no indications of forced entry or foul play. However, they do find evidence downstairs that suggests a different cause of death.
I was talking to the detective, and they said they found a balloon of heroin on the kitchen counter.
So it appears that he had died from a drug overdose.
The theory seems to be confirmed when autopsy reveals a needle mark on Sonny's arm. However, those close to the former champion insist he wasn't an addict.
He hated needles. And so it would be a surprise that he would die from a needle injection. I think what raises the suspicions is that Liston was not known as a heroin user. That raises real red flags.
But as investigators dig further, they discover Sonny had been leading a double life.
He was known to have been dealing at that time.
Liston had known associations with pretty serious narcotics traffickers.
Sonny Liston was influenced by the mob early in his career. Very tough people, you know, and it's tough to get away from people like that, and it was especially tough in them days.
It's unclear how long Sonny had been involved with drugs, but it seems to have spiraled out of control in 1969 as his boxing career slips away. After a hard loss in December of 1969, Sonny lands what would be his final fight against legendary Chuck Wepner.
We had 9,000 people in the Jersey City Army, which was the biggest crowd for any fight in history. He was punching from the opening bell. The referee came in at the end of the 9th round and wanted to stop the fight, and I asked him to let it go one more round. I said, just one more round. I wanted to finish, to kick Sonny Liston's butt and beat him up, and it just didn't happen.
The win earned Sonny only $13,000.
Liston tries to mount a little bit of a comeback. So he's earning a little bit there, but he has to make money in other ways. And it appears that he was doing work, collections, enforcement for people who had organized crime connections. And eventually, it appears that he was doing a little drug trafficking himself.
Liston knew the mob well enough. He was involved in a day-to-day, relationship with them.
Sonny Liston was known as the leg breaker for the mob out in Las Vegas. And it was a fact. He was a money collector.
He's no longer just simply dabbling. He's actually operating and moving in their circles.
But a recent run-in with the law suggests Sonny may have been working both sides of the street, which could have landed him on the mob's hit list.
They had a search warrant for this house. There were 3 people there, and it was Earl Cage, whoever the other guy was, and Sonny Liston. My lieutenant went to Sonny and said, look, we're all friends here, and he took Sonny out of the room. They hauled the other 2 to jail. Sonny got to go home. Well, automatically, they thinking he was an informant or something because Sonny was given a pass.
However, despite growing evidence that Sonny had quite a few deadly enemies, Las Vegas police suddenly closed the case.
The coroner's report showed that there were only trace amounts of morphine in his system, but it wasn't enough to kill him. So they ruled it that it couldn't have been an overdose or homicide.
The coroner attributes Sonny's death to natural causes. But to Sonny's loved ones, his death is anything but natural.
How many heavyweight champions die in this manner? But then, also because of the connections, right, with the criminal underworld, which just begged for speculation in terms of foul play.
With Sonny Liston, so always what happened?
The mafia's involvement in boxing started in the 1940s. Attracted by its money-making potential, Frankie Carbo, a killer for the Lucchese crime family, began to take control of the sport by managing the careers of young fighters with potential.
For a good part of boxing history, boxers have had their careers managed by individuals from the world of organized crime. Oftentimes, these boxers had no other choice but to associate themselves with these underworld figures. If they wanted to pursue a career in their sport of choice, there was often no other avenue to try to become a successful boxer. Sonny Liston was one of the best examples of this, and some people think that that relationship is what ultimately led to his death.
On January 9th, 1971, a funeral is held for Sonny Liston at the Palm Mortuary. It's attended by an overflow crowd, including casino owners, car dealers, showgirls, and mobsters.
From birth to death, there was never a road for redemption for Liston, just a road to perdition. It is truly an American tragedy.
Sonny's loved ones are convinced of only two things. He didn't die of natural causes, and he didn't inject himself with heroin.
Sonny was deathly afraid of needles, and they discovered a needle mark on his arm. And those that knew him well suspected that if there was a needle mark, somebody else was behind it.
It seems possible that Liston's drug connections got him killed, but others believe it happened on the orders of a much more powerful enemy.
There was a big casino operative named Ash Resnick who came out of New York originally. He was a mainstream gambling. Resnick's name has been thrown around as being involved in his death.
Ash Resnick is sort of the organized crime connection for Sonny Liston in Las Vegas. Resnick is the one that sort of sets him up in that nice house. Resnick is also the one doing what organized crime does, right? Fixing fights.
Days before Sonny's death, he and Resnick were seen having two public arguments, one at the Stardust nightclub and the other at the Thunderbird Casino.
Witnesses at the time described these incidents as violent. Nobody knew for sure exactly what they were fighting about, but they definitely had ideas.
They did have a falling out. I heard stories, but never anything I believed.
Is it possible that Sonny Liston ran afoul of Resnick and Resnick, said, nope, this is not gonna fly, we're gonna do something? Absolutely.
Over the years, Sonny and Ash had made a lot of money from boxing, but some questioned exactly how they made it.
You have the criminal element. Yes, you have somebody who's known for participating in fixing fights. Yes, you have somebody who's dabbling in that world to make money.
A recent fight against boxer Chuck Wepner may have sealed Sonny's fate.
Some say he was supposed to throw the fight with Chuck Wepner, but just couldn't do it. The theory was that Ash Resnick and a lot of other mobsters had lost a lot of money betting on that fight.
I wish somebody had told me that. Maybe I should have said to him, hey, Sonny, what are you doing? You were supposed to have thrown this fight. I never heard that story.
Resnick had also been the promoter for both of Sonny's controversial matches with Muhammad Ali. As Sonny's manager, Resnick claimed he lost a lot of money, but it was later discovered that he'd actually made millions.
There's some speculation that Sonny Liston in the second fight takes a dive at the behest of the Nation of Islam, for whom Muhammad Ali was now firmly entrenched. Ali could retain this title in exchange for a percentage of Muhammad Ali's earnings going forward. And that, sort of later on in life, Sonny had begun to talk a little bit too publicly about the fact that he had a percentage of Ali.
The outcome of the first Ali-Liston fight was controversial, but the second is considered one of the most suspicious in boxing history.
Clearly, you look at the tape, he gets hit, but the question is, does he get hit hard enough, to warrant being sprawled out on the ring mat like he was?
For me, the big question wasn't why he went down. What might intrigue me is, why isn't he getting up? And what makes it worse, Ali won't go to a neutral corner because he's standing over him and Ali knows what's going to happen. He says, get up, sucker. They'll say it's fake. Get up, get up, get up. He said, I'm not getting up.
However, many in the boxing world say it's unlikely.
There's stories that the Muslims threatened him, that the mob threatened him, that he made big bets on himself, that everything happened. But why? Why would he do that when the only identity he had, the only segue into real society, to something, was to be the heavyweight champ of the world?
I mean, you got to do a lot of backbending and twisting. It's just too many layers. Too many people need to be involved for that, I think, to really carry any weight in terms of a plausible motivation for Liston to be killed.
But organized crime and shady boxing deals aren't the only possibilities. And as other facets of Sonny's life begin to emerge, so do additional conspiracies.
Sonny had an affair going. Women were like grains of sand. He was womanizing. Sonny had a mistress over there that could have set him up to be killed.
This is a world that was inconceivable to this kid growing up in a backwater in Arkansas. I don't think there was a week went by that he was sexually faithful to Geraldine. She, of course, knew it. You cannot not know it.
Sonny's philandering was bad enough, but Geraldine had a constant reminder of his infidelity living in her house. It turns out their adopted son, Daniel, was actually the product of one of Sonny's flings.
Sonny had a thing with a cocktail waitress, good-looking, busty blonde. One day, him and Geraldine were sitting in a restaurant. She come walking up as this young kid and said, "Here, this is your kid," and handed it to Sonny and walked off.
To prevent a scandal, Geraldine agreed to raise the child, keeping the real story out of the papers. Through the years, she continued to stand by Sonny, but everyone has a breaking point.
My God, did she finally reach her end, says, I can't take it, to the point where she's so fed up that she now arranged for him to get a heroin overdose?
It's not hard to imagine for Geraldine to have built up that kind of animosity towards her husband. And then you take into consideration the things that Geraldine did after she discovered the body.
While Geraldine was never considered a suspect, some find her actions the night she found his body to be suspicious.
When his wife comes home and finds his body, finds him dead and literally decaying, that she doesn't immediately pick up the phone and call the police, but instead, goes to a friend, neighbor's house, and they come back and they spend several hours actually sort of cleaning up the place.
That's just not the kind of thing that you expect a family member to do when they find their loved one dead. Not unless there's something that they didn't want the police to find.
However, others believe there is a more innocent explanation.
The police had been harassing Sonny for as long as Geraldine and Sonny were together. And I'm sure she knew that those drugs were not there before she got there.
They said they found a balloon of heroin on the kitchen counter. And in the same breath, they told me that Geraldine had to clean the house up for 3 hours. How did she miss the heroin? I felt that somebody from the sheriff's office brought that heroin in to get a search warrant so they could look for more drugs from the cache in the house. That's bothered me for, 50 years.
No one knows what police might have been looking for, but the official explanation for Sonny's death would stand unchallenged for the next 10 years, until a witness steps forward with an astonishing new story.
If you're a contract killer, the first person you need to kill after you kill the target and you've been paid is the guy that hired you.
During the 1960s, Las Vegas police were notorious for using extreme methods in their attempts to keep the peace.
They get rid of undesirables mostly by beating them up and dropping them on the other side of state lines. That could be a vagrant, homeless, criminals. That was considered cleaning up the streets. It was a different time, and they truly had a different way of doing things. And it definitely didn't earn them any friends amongst the Black community. And some consider the handling of Sonny's death as very suspicious.
In the years following the death of ex-heavyweight champion Sonny Liston, the residents of Las Vegas continue to question the mysteries surrounding the case.
He could have been a drug user, it could have been an overdose. It also could have been somebody deliberately gave him a hot shot.
The discussions about what happened and the speculation could not be silenced because everyone knew that there were people who had motivation as well as means to do Sonny Liston harm.
Then on June 14th, 1982, a man named Erwin Peters walks into Las Vegas police headquarters with new evidence to share.
Erwin Peters I had used as an informant in the 70s at the Las Vegas Police Department. And I always thought he was very reliable.
He claims that the person that killed Sonny was an undercover detective that was actually at the crime scene.
To their surprise, the man Erwin names as decorated former narcotics detective, Larry Gandy.
He said I gave him a hot shot for $25,000 for Ash Resnick. That was his story. And he told him that we met at the Sahara Saloon.
I'm not trying to make a case that Ash did this, but I will say, if Ash lost his temper and wanted some physical revenge, he had people who could do it for him.
When they track Gandy down, he immediately agrees to answer the allegations.
Anybody ever say I'm ducking and dodging? I'm not. I confront my enemies and I confront the truth. That's all you need in life. They said, do you know that you were accused of killing Sonny Liston? I said, I've never met Sonny Liston. I've never talked to Sonny Liston. They asked me about Ash Resnick, and if I knew him, I said, no, I've never met him. I never talked to him. I never had any dealings with him.
According to him, Erwin had made up the whole story to set him up as a killer.
Erwin Peters is one of the best con men I ever met, and that's why he made such a great informant for me.
It seems Erwin had gotten used to the money he had made being Gandy's informant. That went away when the detective retired. But he might have come up with a new scheme to get paid.
Erwin Peters knew that I had a little money. He knew that I had access to money because I saved. I'm a saver. He was burning through all of his proceeds from his illegal gains and on drugs. He was just, you can't keep up with a heroin burner. And so he came to me wanting more money and I wouldn't give it to him. If Erwin Peters could have proved murder on me of Sonny Liston, it would have been worth thousands between the publicity and from Metro, and they do pay, believe me. Law enforcement operates on money, on paying informants. Not only could he sell the story, he thought, it'd get me a life sentence and get me off the streets, because I was very vindictive.
But Erwin's story is full of holes, and there is no evidence connecting Gandy to the crime.
Well, first thing, I could never be a contract killer. I wouldn't kill anybody for $25,000. The next thing is, any smart hitman, if he kills anybody, once he's paid, he kills the guy that hires him. Because everybody flips on the hitman. It always comes out. The truth always comes out.
As far as investigators are concerned, that ends their brief...
Okay, Sonny, I got one more thing for you to do. Die this way. And leave a mystery behind you.
In the decades since Sonny Liston's mysterious death, many theories have emerged, but none have provided any clear answers.
He's such a great enigma, and he was a great fighter. Everything is a mystery with this guy.
Toxicology reports show that there wasn't enough heroin in his body to kill him. So the coroner said that it was natural causes.
The coroner ruled Sonny died of heart failure and lung disease.
A lot of people question how an athlete could die that way.
His report had ended the possibility that Sonny's death could be investigated as a murder.
It's not like there's a long track record of mob bosses killing boxers for failing to deliver and taking a dive. I think what is on firmer ground is to say that the refusal on the part of the Las Vegas Police Department to launch not just a serious investigation, but any investigation speaks to their willingness to willfully look away. The only way you get that is by somebody with some real influence and power saying, stand down. And that's what they did.
But in 2011, a discussion on an online boxing forum sheds further light on Sonny's final days.
According to the timeline, Liston was busy that week. He traveled to LA to meet with Paramount Studios about a movie deal, and also he had met with a boxer about a fight in Japan. Telephone records show that he made 2 phone calls to Geraldine and several phone calls to a hotel that he dealt drugs out of. He checked out of the Biltmore Hotel around midnight in downtown Los Angeles and then drove back to Las Vegas.
That put Sonny back at his home around 6 a.m. Wednesday, December 30th. And according to reports, he was met there by an unarmed narcotics agent who came with a message that gives more weight to a potential motive.
I think he was a snitch for John Sleeper.
John Sleeper was a controversial member of the Las Vegas Police Department who'd just been fired shortly before Sonny's death. Was it John Sleeper who paid Sonny the visit that night? And if so, why?
The speculation was that John Sleeper was there to give Sonny a warning. He had lost his job at the police department and he wouldn't be able to cover for Sonny anymore. So Sonny was now on his own.
He was always dependent upon the protection of other people. And so what happens when you lose that protection? In that sort of toxic environment, you don't have any protection when that blowback comes on you.
Did the seedy underbelly of Las Vegas catch up to Sonny despite Sleeper's warning?
It was in the opinion if somebody had killed him for being an informant for John Sleeper, that they would have injected him with a hot shot after having drinks, passed out. It only takes one load and you're gone. He was too big and too tough to say, here, I'm gonna give you a shot. Are you kidding me? Heavyweight champion of the world, he'd beat you to a pulp. If he didn't want something, you're not gonna give it to him. Whoever killed him, it had to be a total setup.
But without any evidence, it's just another murder theory.
The whole thing was a bad situation. It's never been proved. And if he was killed, the killers have probably gone to their grave.
50 years after Sonny Liston's death, we are still searching for the truth. But the more time that passes, the less likely it is we will ever find out.
There's always a question mark, but listen, he's just one of those interesting people that'll always be provocative for the public. He was anticipated to be the best heavyweight of all. That doesn't pan out. The great tragedy is he may have been able to turn them around, but he just didn't have the inner strength to do it. And he just fell back to really what he was, which is a guy with criminal intent from the time he was born and just never rose out of that. The money and the fame couldn't do it. Just wasn't strong enough to rise above it.
kill. Triple kill.